Your sister's wedding is the family priority. We won't be able to come to yours, my mother said calmly, like she was canceling a lunch reservation instead of choosing one daughter over another. I smiled, told her I understood, and ended the call. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had just finalized the purchase of a private multi-million-dollar estate in southern Italy, and they wouldn't find out until it was far too late to pretend they cared. Before I take you into how that silence turned into the loudest moment of my life, take a second to support the story, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment saying where you're watching from. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Growing up in the polished social circles of Lakeview Heights, my younger sister Lila was the showpiece. She was the bright front facade meant to be admired. I was the structure behind it, the beams, the foundation, the load-bearing parts no one noticed unless something failed. I learned my place early. When I was 10, I asked for a telescope. I wanted to see Saturn's rings, wanted to look beyond our manicured dining room and the suffocating expectations that lived inside it. On my birthday, my mother handed me a professional makeup palette instead. She smiled and said, "Boys don't fall in love with girls who stare at the sky. They fall in love with girls who know how to look beautiful." I didn't cry. I slid the palette into a drawer and started saving my allowance to buy the telescope myself. That became the pattern. When I brought home perfect grades, my father would pat my shoulder and say, "Well, at least you're smart. It makes up for the rest." As if discipline were an accident. As if my quiet weekends studying, while Lila attended galas, were some genetic fluke instead of survival. They call me practical, boring, sensible. They thought my consulting job was a modest desk role that paid rent and nothing more. They didn't know I was a sustainable systems architect. I didn't design houses. I redesigned how the ultra-wealthy lived without being seen. Hidden solar grids for estates in the Alps. Wind systems buried into the landscape of private compounds. My work powered lives my parents couldn't buy access to. I wasn't just comfortable. I was wealthy. Silently. Strategically. Intentionally. And I never told them. Why would I? To them, worth only existed if it could be photographed and posted. My value lived underground, humming quietly where no one could steal it. That's how I found the estate. It was a neglected 17th century villa outside Montepietra, listed for years and dismissed by everyone who saw decay instead of potential. Crumbling stone. Overgrown land. A collapsed roof. They saw ruin. I saw bones. I bought it through an LLC 3 months before the phone call. I spent weekends there alone, walking through lavender fields and touching cold limestone walls that had survived revolutions. For the first time in my life, silence wasn't punishment. It was luxury. I was rebuilding the villa, and I was rebuilding myself. I just didn't realize how soon I'd need both. The conversation that ended everything didn't happen in anger. It happened over espresso in my parents' living room, surrounded by furniture that cost more than my first car and smelled faintly of lilies and control. Lila sat across from me, clutching her phone like scripture. "Vogue Italia has an opening," she said breathlessly. "But the feature needs to be the second weekend of June. The lighting is better." "That's my wedding date," I replied evenly. My mother sighed. "Be reasonable. Lila's career depends on exposure. You're private. You don't even have social media. November would suit you better." "It suits your budget better," I said. My father didn't look up from his tablet. "This isn't a discussion. Lila gets June. We'll cover your change fees if they're not outrageous." I waited for the sting. The familiar ache. It didn't come. Instead, something snapped cleanly inside me. Not pain. Clarity. For 30 years, I thought being invisible was a punishment. Sitting there watching Lila chase angles and my parents dismiss my existence, I realized it had been protection. They couldn't stop what they never saw. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't tell them my budget could buy their entire block. I opened my tablet and canceled my venue. Non-refundable deposit gone. To them, a disaster. To me, a transaction fee. "Fine," I said calmly. They smiled, thinking they'd won. They didn't know I hadn't just canceled a venue. I'd canceled my membership in their family. 3 months later, I was standing on a steel scaffold nearly 20 feet above ground, breathing in limestone dust and wild rosemary while the estate slowly woke up beneath me. The villa didn't feel old anymore. It felt patient, like it had been waiting for someone who understood it. The velvet drapes were gone, the rotting beams exposed, and the shutters, sealed for decades, were finally open. Light poured into rooms that had forgotten what daylight looked like. It wasn't gentle light either. It was bold, unapologetic, the kind that reveals flaws and beauty at the same time. I wasn't just renovating a house. I was engineering a statement. At the heart of the property, I approved the final plans for a transparent solar atrium, glass so advanced it looked invisible, capable of powering the entire estate without disrupting the centuries-old architecture. Technology hidden in plain sight. Quiet power. My favorite kind. My phone buzzed on the workbench below. It had been buzzing for weeks, but I hadn't answered a single message. I climbed down, wiped my hands on a rag, and glanced at the screen. A text from Lila. Since you saved so much money canceling your venue, Mom thinks it's fair you cover the photographer upgrade. It's only $12,000. Vogue needs specific lighting. Please transfer by tonight. I stared at the message, feeling nothing. Not anger. Not surprise. Just recognition. Then a voicemail from my mother followed. I pressed play and let her voice echo against 400-year-old stone. Don't be childish. Going silent just because things didn't go your way is selfish. We're under a lot of stress making this perfect for your sister, and your behavior is making everything harder. Pick up the phone and act like an adult. They imagined me in a cramped apartment, sulking, waiting to be forgiven. They thought silence was my punishment. They didn't understand the math of our family. 4 decades, I had been the contrast. The plain one so the beautiful one could shine. The practical one so the glamorous one could sparkle. For Lila to be extraordinary, I had to be ordinary. That was the unspoken agreement. By leaving, I hadn't just stepped away. I'd shattered the comparison. Without me standing quietly in the background, Lila's extravagance didn't look impressive anymore. It looked desperate, and desperation is loud. I didn't respond to the text. I didn't return the call. Instead, I opened my banking app, glanced at a balance large enough to fund their entire wedding twice over, and transferred nothing. Then I approved the final delivery schedule for the atrium glass arriving from Germany. They wanted me to pay for lighting. I was paying for lighting, just not theirs. 5 months before the wedding, I initiated what I privately called the load transfer. In architecture, when a structural element fails, you don't patch it with sentiment. You redistribute the weight to something stronger. My nuclear family had been unstable for years, relying on my silence to keep it standing. It was time to move the load. I opened my laptop on the terrace as the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in copper and violet. The air smelled like warm stone and lavender. I didn't open a wedding website. I didn't hire a calligrapher. I opened an encrypted email. The guest list was short. First was my Aunt Marianne, my mother's sister. She'd been quietly exiled years ago for divorcing a wealthy man who treated her like decor. My mother called her embarrassing. I called her brave. Second was my cousin Eve, the so-called disappointment, who dropped out of law school to open a bakery. My father said she wasted her potential. She used to sneak me science books when I was 12 and whisper, "Don't let them make you small." Third was my grandmother Irene, 90 years old and largely ignored at family events because she didn't photograph well. She was the one who taught me how to read blueprints at her kitchen table. I typed one message. I'm getting married on June 14th. Not in the States. I'm sending a plane. You're the only family invited. Pack for son. I hit send. I expected questions. I expected hesitation. Instead, responses came within minutes. Marianne. Finally. Eve. Packing now. Irene via her nurse. I have a new hat. They didn't ask about Lila. They didn't ask why. They already knew. 2 weeks later, they arrived. Watching them step onto the estate felt like color rushing back into a black and white photograph. Eve dropped her bag and immediately opened every shutter she could reach. Marian walked into the vineyard, took one breath, and started crying, not from sadness but from relief. Irene sat beneath the finished solar atrium, sunlight filtering softly through glass no one could see, and squeezed my hand. "You built this," she said quietly. "This isn't a house. It's a stronghold." Back in Lakeview Heights, my phone continued collecting voicemails. Complaints about wind ruining hair trials. About floral imports costing more than expected. About my silence being disrespectful. Here, we ate bread dipped in oil pressed from our own trees. We were warm. I realized I hadn't just invited guests. I'd assembled a family that chose me. The morning of the wedding, I woke before sunrise. The villa was quiet but alive, the soft sounds of caterers preparing in the courtyard drifting through open windows. I checked my phone once. Lila had posted again. Countdown begins. She always gets more. She uploaded a close-up of an elegant wine bottle, gold lettering on black glass. Only the best, the caption read. Sourced from a private Italian vineyard. I laughed out loud, because she didn't know. That wine wasn't Italian. It was mine. Months earlier, I'd bottled a limited run from my vineyard and released it quietly through a distributor under a shell name for brand exposure. My mother, hungry for exclusivity, had snapped it up immediately. They were serving my wine, pouring my work into crystal glasses while mocking my absence. I closed my phone. The sun was rising, and the real wedding was about to begin. The ceremony began just as the sun dipped low enough to soften the heat. The light in Monte Pietro wasn't bright the way city light is. It was liquid, heavy, slow-moving, like it had all the time in the world. I stood at the edge of the courtyard, listening to the quiet shuffle of footsteps on stone, the faint clink of glasses being set down, the murmur of voices that carried no expectation except presence. I didn't wear white. I wore gold, clean lines, structured silk, a dress that felt less like fabric and more like architecture. It caught the light without trying to own it. Christopher was waiting beneath the solar atrium, the glass above us almost invisible, the stone around us glowing as if it had absorbed centuries of sunlight and decided to give some of it back. As I walked toward him, I saw faces that had never once asked me to shrink. Marianne, dabbing at her eyes. Eve, holding her phone loosely, not to perform but to remember. Grandma Irene, wrapped in a shawl, sitting straight-backed like a queen who had waited a very long time to be acknowledged. This wasn't a spectacle. It was alignment. The officiant spoke about foundations, how structures fail when they're built for appearance instead of load, how beauty that doesn't rest on truth always collapses under pressure. I felt Christopher's hand steady in mine, felt the stone beneath my feet solid and cool. When we said our vows, there was no audience hunger in the air. No need to impress. Just witnesses. What I didn't know then was that Eve had quietly started a live stream. Not to go viral. Not to compete. She titled it without thinking, The Other Wedding. At first, it was just a few dozen viewers. Family friends. People who had always been told they weren't important enough for the front row. But the contrast was impossible to ignore. A sunlit stone estate versus a gray ballroom. Real laughter versus forced smiles. Quiet wealth versus loud performance. The algorithm noticed. By the time Christopher kissed me, the viewer count had jumped into the thousands. By the time dried lavender rained down on us as we walked back through the courtyard, it had multiplied again. Photos were already spreading. In Lakeview Heights, guests were being seated for dinner. Phones were lighting up under tables. People leaned toward each other, whispering, scrolling, frowning. My parents weren't watching the room anymore. They were watching their screens. Marianne told me later that my mother was the first to realize something was wrong. She leaned over a guest's shoulder, her polite smile still in place, until her eyes widened and her hand went instinctively to her chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was recognition. She saw the estate, the scale, the certainty, the daughter she had written off standing in the center of a life she had never been allowed to imagine. Across the ballroom, Lila noticed the shift, the energy draining from the room. She grabbed a phone from a bridesmaid and scrolled. She saw the live stream. She saw the stone arches, the glass atrium, the way the light curved around everything instead of flattening it. And then her gaze dropped to the wine bottle on the table in front of her. The label, the crest, the vineyard rose in the background of the photo matched perfectly. Her breath caught. She wasn't just being overshadowed. She was serving my success to her guests. Her phone slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a sharp crack, but no one noticed. Everyone was too busy staring at something else. Back in Monte Pietro, the sun had fully set. Lanterns glowed softly along the terrace. We sat at a long wooden table, passing bread and oil pressed from the trees outside the walls. Laughter rose and fell naturally, without anyone checking angles or lighting. I felt it then, a subtle shift, like a building settling after a long renovation. The moment the last temporary support is removed and the structure stands on its own. I didn't feel triumph. I felt balance. For years, I thought justice would feel loud, like watching them fall apart, like forcing an apology they could never fully give. But this wasn't destruction. This was creation. They had spent their lives building a stage, obsessing over optics, applause, control. I had been planting something quieter, something slower, something that didn't bloom on command. And now it had. I wasn't stealing their spotlight. I was standing in my own sun. The aftermath didn't explode. It seeped in. Messages changed tone overnight. Lila texted first. "Everyone keeps asking about your venue." I told them, "You've always had great taste. We should collaborate on something." Not an apology. A pivot. My mother followed with a voicemail, her voice thinner than I remembered. "We just didn't know. Why didn't you tell us? We would have been so proud. We miss you." They didn't miss me. They missed access. They missed reflection. They missed the way my success could have made them look important. I didn't block them. Blocking implies emotion. I muted the thread. Silence had become my most precise tool. The next morning, Christopher and I walked the vineyard perimeter together, discussing irrigation and harvest timing. The air was warm, heavy with the smell of earth and sun. Chicago felt distant, like a place I had once lived in a dream. That evening, I set the table again. 5 chairs. Then I added a 6th at the far end. I didn't set a plate there. Instead, I tied a simple olive green ribbon around the back of the chair. Loose. Unforced. Christopher watched me quietly. "For them?" he asked. "For possibility," I said. I wasn't waiting. I wasn't inviting them back. I was acknowledging that the door existed, but I held the key. The chair could remain empty without hurting me. That realization settled deeper than any victory ever could. I poured the wine. My wine. From my land. I raised my glass to the people who had chosen me. "To the builders," I said. And for the first time in my life, the ground beneath me felt permanent. The days after the wedding didn't arrive with fireworks. They arrived quietly, like the last echo of a bell fading into open air. That silence wasn't emptiness anymore. It was space, clean, intentional, finally mine. Christopher and I stayed in Monte Pietro longer than planned. Mornings began with coffee on the terrace, the stone still cool beneath bare feet. Afternoons were spent walking the vineyard rows, checking soil moisture, adjusting the new irrigation system. I wasn't pretending to be something else anymore. I wasn't hiding intelligence behind politeness or muting my competence to keep the peace. I was exactly where my instincts had always been leading me, just without resistance now. Back in Lakeview Heights, the story was unraveling in real time. Marianne called first, her voice half amused, half stunned. "Your mother hasn't stopped talking about it," she said. "About how no one ever told her, and how it must have all happened so fast. She's rewriting history at record speed." I wasn't surprised. People who survive on image always do that. When reality exposes them, they rush to repaint the past so it doesn't contradict their self-image. Lila tried again a few days later. This time it wasn't a text. It was a carefully worded email. Subject line, "Family Matters." She wrote about reconciliation, about how weddings bring things into perspective, about how she'd always admired my discipline and never meant for things to feel competitive. She suggested a private dinner. Just the two of us. No parents. No tension. It read like a press release. I didn't respond. My mother followed with flowers delivered to the Château. White orchids. Expensive. Dramatic. A note tucked inside. "We're so proud of you. Call me." I gave them to the local staff. The orchids thrived better without the weight of expectation attached. The truth was simpler than they wanted it to be. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires engagement. Anger still gives the other person a role. They no longer had one. A week later, Christopher and I hosted a small dinner for the people who had stayed behind. Marianne, Eve, Grandma Irene, a few locals who had helped restore the estate. No dress code. No speeches. No phones on the table. Just food, wine, and conversation that didn't orbit status. At one point, Grandma Irene leaned back in her chair and looked around slowly. "This," she said, gesturing with her glass, "is what family was supposed to feel like." That was when I knew I hadn't just left something behind. I had replaced it. News travels differently when you're no longer trying to manage it. People talk when they're confused, when the old story stops working. The questions started circulating quietly in the circles my parents cared about most. Where did the money come from? Why didn't anyone know? Why wasn't she invited to the Chicago wedding? And the most dangerous question of all, why had they underestimated me so completely? My parents tried to answer those questions without ever mentioning their own choices. They framed it as mystery, as coincidence, as something that had slipped through the cracks. But the cracks had names: neglect, control, convenience. Eventually, the call slowed. The messages spaced out. Not because they understood, but because they realized there was no leverage left. I wasn't asking for approval. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't correcting the narrative. I had stepped outside it. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for the next phase of restoration, I found myself standing alone in the atrium, sunlight filtering through the glass panels I had designed. The technology was invisible, but the effect was undeniable. Warmth without glare, light without exposure. It felt symbolic in a way that didn't need to be explained. Christopher joined me, slipping an arm around my waist. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. I thought about the girl who had learned early that being useful was safer than being visible. The woman who had mistaken silence for humility instead of strategy. The years spent believing love had to be earned through compliance. "No," I said. "Just clarity." We talked about the future then, not in grand declarations, but in practical terms. Expanding the vineyard, hosting retreats for architects and engineers who cared about sustainability more than spectacle. Turning the Château into a place where people could build without being consumed. A space for builders, not performers. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The vines thickened. The olive trees bore fruit. Life didn't get louder. It got steadier. The final message came on a quiet Tuesday evening. My father. No subject line. Just 4 sentences. "I didn't realize how much you had accomplished. We should have paid more attention. I hope someday you'll let us visit." I read it once. Then I archived it. Not deleted. Archived. Some doors don't need to be slammed. They just need to stay closed until the person on the other side learns how to knock. That night, Christopher and I sat at the long table again, candles flickering low. I poured the wine. The real one. The one that came from patience, not performance. I raised my glass, not in defiance, not in victory. In acknowledgement. To the life I built quietly while they were watching something else. To the strength it took to stop auditioning for a role I was never meant to play. To the freedom that comes when you stop waiting for permission. If you've ever been told to step aside so someone else could shine, remember this. You don't need their spotlight when you've built your own sun. If this story resonated with you, support the channel, share it with someone who needs it, and let your presence here help these stories reach the people who are still finding their way out of the dark.